Well, we have big breaking news at this hour. There will not be another government shutdown over the Trump wall, according to congressional negotiators. Bipartisan leaders of a congressional conference committee reached a deal tonight on continuing funding of the government. We will be joined in a moment by a member of that conference committee. This is the person we need to hear from about what is really inside of this deal, because details of that deal are not yet public. But it has been a very consistent Democratic demand that there will be no funding for a Trump wall on the southern border in any deal. That bipartisan deal was taking shape this afternoon when President Trump boarded Air Force One, headed for El Paso, Texas. And so what happened tonight in El Paso was not really about governing. That was happening back in Washington. It was really about the presidential campaign coming to El Paso, Texas tonight. Donald Trump won the presidency saying Mexico would pay for a wall on our southern border, and he went to our southern border tonight to insist that American taxpayers should pay for that wall now that Mexico has refused to pay for it. That is his re-election campaign position. The president's campaign for the wall and for re-election met resistance in El Paso tonight by El Paso's native son and possible presidential candidate Beto O'Rourke, who joined a rally in opposition to the Trump rally in El Paso. Former Democratic Congressman O'Rourke promised that his rally tonight would, quote, meet lies and hate with the truth. El Paso, Texas is a major American city with a population the same size as Boston. It is more than big enough to hold two competing presidential campaign-style events at the same time, and it did that tonight. Here's Beto O'Rourke speaking tonight, very close to where the president was speaking.
We stand for America, and we stand against walls. We know that there is no bargain in which we can sacrifice some of our humanity to gain a little more security. We know that we deserve and will lose both of them if we do. We stand for the best traditions and values of this country, for our fellow humanity and who we are when we are at our best, and that's El Paso, Texas. I'm glad the country's here to see us.
Now to that breaking news about the deal in the congressional negotiators. We are joined by Democratic Congressman David Price of North Carolina. He is one of the members of that bipartisan conference committee working out this deal. Congressman Price, what can you tell us tonight about the elements of the deal? Is there any funding for a Trump wall in this deal?
Yes, there is funding for a wall in this deal, but it is something considerably less than the concrete barrier that he was talking about, and it is far less than the funding in any of the alternatives that we were dealing with. In other words, the number is less than the $2 billion that would be available, a good deal less than the $2 billion that would be available if we simply passed a continuing resolution for the rest of the year. And of course, it's many billions less than what Trump shut down the government over. So the wall didn't fare too well.
So, Congressman, just to underline this for the audience, in the Congress had already passed some initial funding for some of certainly the planning, at least, of the Trump wall on the southern border. And you're saying that if the Congress just continued spending as is, there would have been more funding for that than there is in the deal that you reached tonight.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. I also think it needs to be said, although you'd never know it listening to the president, that we have a lot of fence down on the southern border. You know, it was built back 8-10 years ago and has been added to some since then. About 650 miles of fence in places where you could argue a physical barrier is needed. But so much has changed since then. I mean, the attempted crossings are at a historic low, a 40-year low. The mix of people coming to the border is now people turning themselves in, families, unaccompanied children. A wall, of course, is irrelevant to that. And then there are all kinds of other security measures, to say nothing of Homeland Security priorities in the Coast Guard and elsewhere, that just make a lot more sense than the wall. And so this was all about the president making a demagogic campaign promise that even the Republicans hadn't stressed. But he did, of course, get it into the mix here. But I think we, in these negotiations, pretty well minimized what that would be compared to any other alternative.
Has, to your knowledge, Speaker Pelosi given her blessing to this deal?
I can't tell you that. This was just concluded, an hour and a half ago, and so I'm really not able to give you precise details. In fact, some of those have yet to be worked out. It's not. It has to be called tentative at this point, but it does look like, in principle, there is an agreement, and I would assume the leadership has checked in on this, but I can't give you chapter and verse.
Did you on the House side, the leading Republican in the negotiation is a Texas Congresswoman. Did you sense much fight really on the Republican side for the Trump wall?
Well, it has not been a priority for Republicans. That's one of the ironies of this. You know, the question of detention practices, not just detention beds, but who's in those beds. And what we've had in North Carolina just in the last 48 hours, 200 or so people picked up in more or less random raids, and ICE poking our local law enforcement in the eye in the process. This is just out of hand. And so for years now, we have debated about detention beds and about detention practices, and so that's an ongoing issue. That's been an issue for a decade, and it was an issue throughout these negotiations. The wall has not been. As I said, we built 700 miles of wall some years ago, but the Republicans haven't pressed it in recent years. This is something the president came up with on the campaign trail.
And Congressman, what about those beds? That seems to be, according to news reports, the final negotiating point.
Well, it was very disappointing to see the president tweeting about this in a very, very untruthful way. He said this was a last-minute issue, like somebody was moving the goalposts. Goodness, we've debated this for a decade, and certainly debated it during this 3-week period. Nobody threw this up at the last minute. It's been a critical element in this. We've always known that there were a number of elements here: funding for ICE, funding for Border Patrol, the kind of agreement we would reach on the wall. All these things were related to each other. So it was something that has been discussed all along, and there's an element in this agreement that is going to make it possible to reduce the number of those beds. The point is, though, who's in the beds, and how is our policy focused? And it is Democrats, I must say, dating from the time when we came into leadership in 2007. We're the ones who have said, focus on dangerous criminals, focus on people who will harm our communities. And don't get away from this indiscriminate, workplace raids, or just going after people in many cases who have been here for years, just putting terror in the community. That is unacceptable. It is way, way too prevalent in this administration. And so at bottom, that's really what this debate's about.
Congressman Price, when I was working in the Senate, I saw two kinds of conference committees. One in which the administration was heavily involved. That would be the leaders, the bipartisan leaders, would be consulting with the administration, the White House, to make sure that the White House was on board and they would have a presidential signature. I've seen conference committees where they ignored the White House, saying we're going to do this and pass this, and in effect sort of jam the White House, force them to sign it. Do you know how much consultation there has been with the leaders of the conference committee and the White House?
I think there's been consultation all along, and of course, Senator Shelby, the head of the Republican conference group in the Senate, had a well-publicized meeting with the president last week. we've known all along that the president could blow this up, and I suppose he still could. I mean, Mick Mulvaney was talking over the weekend about a shutdown still being on the table. He shut down the government before. He could do it again. But the Republicans really got burned with that shutdown, and Republican senators, after waiting way too long, did come around, I think, and sent the message to the White House, to their own leadership and to the White House, that this was just not working and it had to end. And so I think the president pretty well had that message. And so when he says he had turned this over to the senators and House members to negotiate, and that he was likely to go along with the result, I do believe that's true. I don't expect a shutdown to come. But, of course, we've already been through a shutdown, the longest in American history, and the only one really instigated by a president.
And our discussion is joined now by John Sandweg. He's the former acting director of Immigration and Customs Enforcement under President Obama. Also with us, Jason Johnson. He's the politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor. And John Sandweg, I want to get your reaction to what you're hearing about the elements of this deal tonight.
Well, it sounds to me like we went through a shutdown for basically the same deal the president was put on his desk in December. And I applaud the congressman for holding the line on the wall. That would be an excessive waste of money. But I think what the frustrating thing is, we cannot seem to have an accurate, an immigration debate in this country that's based on the facts. As soon as immigration issues come up, it all gets filled with, as the congressman said, demagoguery, talking about, drugs coming across the border, terrorists coming across the border, and waves of criminals. The reality is we have a unique opportunity right now to talk about immigration issues because we've never had a more secure border. We've never had fewer people crossing that border, and over 50%, amazingly, over 50% of all the people crossing that border are parents with their children or unaccompanied minors. But, it's unfortunate if you can't have a debate about immigration today that's based on facts. I'm not sure when you can have it.
Jason Johnson, it's sounding like the deal, as Congressman Price has outlined for us, means that Donald Trump got absolutely nothing from the shutdown.
Yeah, he didn't. He got a worse deal than he got before, Lawrence. Well, I will say this. Let's be fair. What the president did gain is a huge drop in his popularity numbers. What the president did gain is the fact that he's going to take a hit as our economy fails to recover this fall. What the president did gain is the opportunity to lose a lot of weight in terms of the congressional seats that he's going to lose in 2020. This was an abject failure on almost every single level. He failed to negotiate. He failed to provide his own party with any leadership. And what he did was empower Nancy Pelosi in a way that he never could have imagined before the shutdown began. I cannot think, and we often talk about this, Lawrence, is this the worst week of this presidency? I don't know if this is the worst week of the presidency. I don't know if the shutdown was the worst 3 weeks of the presidency, but it certainly was the time in this presidency where Donald Trump completely ceded the narrative and the power to Nancy Pelosi, and I don't think if he'll be able to get it back anytime during this legislative session.
Let's listen to more of what Beto O'Rourke had to say tonight in El Paso, Texas, while the president was speaking there, too.
We stand for the Constitution of the United States of America and against emergency national security declarations that would allow the president to subvert an equal branch of government, build a wall when we do not need it, 1.6 million apprehensions the first year of the George W. Bush administration, a little more than 300,000 apprehensions last year. And you know who we are apprehending? Kids, children. If they are lucky, they're there with their moms or dads. We will not send them back to certain death. We will not believe that walls can or should keep them out. Instead, we welcome them with open arms.
Congressman Price, your former colleague, former Congressman O'Rourke there, talking about a possible emergency declaration by the president. Were you getting any indication from Republicans that they expect after this deal that the president might go into some sort of emergency declaration to try to put more funding into a wall?
I haven't heard that as much lately. I think he very definitely was thinking about that as recently as the State of the Union address. My observation was that he was possibly laying the basis for an emergency declaration. But he's gotten a lot of pushback on that, and he should. It would be a really, really bad idea, a very dangerous precedent. And so I don't see our Republican colleagues pushing him in that direction, with maybe a very few exceptions.
I want to listen to something else that Beto O'Rourke said tonight, countering what Donald Trump has been saying about the criminal history of the city of El Paso. President Trump has presented it as one of the most crime-ridden cities in the country until there was a border wall built in that area. And all of the real facts of the case say that that isn't true. Let's listen to what Beto O'Rourke said tonight.
Here, a city that has been one of the safest in the United States of America for 20 years and counting, safe long before a wall was built here in 2008. In fact, a little less safe after that wall was built. We can show the rest of the country as we make our stand here together tonight that walls do not make us safer. Walls will require us to take someone's property, their house, their farm, their ranch. We, together, we are making a stand for the truth against lies and hate and ignorance and intolerance. We are going to show the country who we are.
John Sandweg, it was Beto O'Rourke, lifelong resident of El Paso, versus Donald Trump, visitor to El Paso tonight.
It was Beto O'Rourke and data versus Donald Trump, visitor to El Paso. Look, the reality is that the border communities along our border have always been some of the safest communities in the United States. When I was at DHS, we spent a lot of time looking at the nexus between, flow and unlawful flow of individuals at the border and crime rates in the United States, and couldn't find a nexus. Look, it's the wall. There are places where a wall can be helpful. I think El Paso, Juarez, there are some immigration-related reasons why a wall can be effective there. But this border is not a one-size-fits-all border. And this notion that somehow the wall or border security has a direct correlation to crime is just rebutted by the data across the board.
Jason Johnson, there's a new chant tonight. We now saw a preview there in El Paso tonight on the Trump side of what the campaign chant's going to be. Donald Trump is now instructing his audiences that the new chant has to be "Finish the wall," because he is telling them that he is already building it and building significant portions of it. And so the new chant for the re-election campaign, Donald Trump wants it to be "Finish the wall."
Yeah, Lawrence, there was a lot of tonight that I think it tells us a lot about 2020. I think we just saw a preview of the finals here. If Beto O'Rourke gets into this race, and I have said all along that as strong as the current Democratic field is, they do not have a white male running who is prominent. There are white men who've announced, but they don't have a high-profile, top-tier white candidate running. I think what Beto O'Rourke demonstrated tonight is that he can rally crowds. Being at the border, it gives him a unique perspective on a singular issue that he can attack Donald Trump on. And the president is basically trying to rehash old Coke here by finish the wall versus build the wall. Look, the president's going to have a new message in 2020 because he's definitely going to be facing a new candidate. And I think, I think O'Rourke has established tonight that he can stand head-to-head with President Trump. And if he announced that he's going to run by the end of this month, Democrats should be happy.
Jason Johnson, thank you for joining us tonight. John Sandweg, thank you for joining us with your expertise. And most especially Congressman David Price, one of the conferees on this conference committee. Thank you for joining us and bringing us that news about what is actually in this deal. Just a final question, Congressman. Do you expect this deal to pass the House of Representatives and the Senate?
Yes, I do. It's, of course, not everything that anybody wanted. It is a compromise, but we did hold out successfully for getting that wall number down just as low as it could possibly be. We also got the detention beds down. But then again, that's not about beds per se. It's about an absolutely reprehensible deportation policy. And we're going to live to fight another day on these other issues. The flow of refugees has just been cut off. The separation at the border. There is the betrayal of the Dreamers. It's so much, but we'll fight those battles another day. I do believe this will keep the government open and will keep the department funded until we have a new fiscal year.
Congressman David Price, thank you very much for joining us with what we are all hoping is good news. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.